The loneliest people tend to have the biggest hearts. That's not hyperbolic or a setup for a joke. Lonely people genuinely, more often than not, have an abundance of love that they desperately want to share, but most likely are too absorbed in the idea of how they're perceived to even allow themselves to accept from others. And I want to make this distinction now before we move any further. This is going to speak more to men's experiences more than it will speak to women's, but I strongly encourage any women watching this to stick around, not only so you can share this with a man in your life, but also gain some insight on what some of the men closest to you may be dealing with or feeling internally. But as I'm writing this, June is pretty much over, and thus Men's Mental Health Awareness Month is too. But even before June, there was a lot of talk and chatter over social media about the male loneliness epidemic, and I'll be 100% blunt, everybody had the wrong idea when discussing the topic, mainly because 90% of the discourse was anecdotal and came from a place of bitterness toward their own unique past circumstances, but also because y'all made it about men versus women when it was really men versus societal expectations. For centuries, men have been told that their suffering is strength and that their value as a person is tied directly to how little they can bleed on other people. The minute a man numbs himself, he's suddenly respected more. You shed your desire to be emotionally intimate with someone, and now you're seen as a strong figure that can handle their own when the going gets rough. And here's where society skews the narrative. They instill the idea in men that the only safe place to actually relieve any of those undesirables is with women. But now Houston, we have a problem. Women didn't sign up for that. They don't want to be nurses that patch men back together after shedding their emotions off. So because men for hundreds of years were passed down a map made by the very people who were already lost, Gen Z has done what Gen Z always does and slapped a fancy buzzword or a phrase onto a phenomenon we've already been experiencing since we formed the concept of gender roles. But the problem isn't men lacking or losing the desire for connection to people. It's the fact that at their most impressionable point in life, they were robbed of the opportunity to learn how to have that connection in the first place. The thing about how society raises children that I absolutely detest is this idea of separating girls from boys at just about every point possible, all the way down to how they think. Like, young girls are raised being taught emotional awareness, not intelligence. Video on that coming soon. But these girls are raised being built up into women. Meanwhile, young boys are only told what parts of themselves to remove in order to fit their predetermined societal mold. I'll say it again. Young ladies are taught, encouraged, and built to become women. Boys are just forced to chip away at any part of their identity that isn't deemed suitable for a version of men that they were told is correct. When a boy is faced with adversity and shows the slightest sign of fear, he doesn't get consoled, he doesn't get held. Instead, he gets told to just ignore his own nervous system screaming at him and maybe a pat on the back. Picture this, a little boy is standing at the edge of the pool, absolutely terrified to jump in. You know what the most common reaction from other men is? To tell that boy to simply stop being scared. No comfort, no encouragement, no guidance. Children are unfathomably smarter than we give them credit for. So when you tell that little boy to stop being scared, he doesn't hear there isn't anything to be afraid of. He hears that there's another part of his identity that he has to abandon. He feels like he can't be scared, he's not allowed to feel fear, and he'll go on to project that perception of manhood onto other boys and men that he encounters later in life. And that's how the vicious cycle continues. And remember how I mentioned boys being raised to believe that women were the only safe spaces for their emotional baggage to be stored? Surprise, surprise, this carries into adulthood because more often than not, they aren't taught any better until their first real relationship. So I'm going to tell you what happens and why this dynamic is so misunderstood. The woman will eventually grow tired of bearing the emotional weight of two people, sometimes more depending on what her parents and home life were like. And the second she verbalizes that frustration, the man's old nervous system hardware gets reactivated. So now it's time to abandon those feelings, time to detach, time to hold back. And more often than not, this is where relationships start to fall apart because the woman is completely blindsided by the man's emotional detachment. And the man is only responding accordingly to a demand his 6-year-old self was always expected to meet with no objection. Sit with that for a second, rewind it if you have to. This is real life shit. But this is the hardest pill to swallow. Most men are aware to some degree that it's not women's fault. Men are angry at the world that robbed them of the opportunity to already be what they have to spend hundreds of hours and thousands of dollars in therapy becoming. Men are upset that their identity is an empty shell. Every bit of substance, depth, curiosity, and creativity you had as a child had to get bundled up and tossed into an incinerator just so you could appease the standards of a society that disregarded your humanity before they labeled you a servant. Y'all don't want to hear this, but men aren't feeling lonely just because women are being more selective with who they date now. Men are feeling lonely because their value and worth as a man is only recognized once they abandon themselves entirely. And I'm pretty sure you've heard this 1,000 times at this point, you know, loneliness doesn't mean you're alone. And I definitely agree with that. It's just that a lot of people are trying to put so much emphasis on the meaning and the words that the feeling gets phased out of the conversation altogether. Like, it's actually kind of funny, and I was genuinely laughing while writing this, but we already kind of have a direct comparison to what loneliness truly feels like. It's just emotional burnout. The idea should never be that there's something wrong with you, because if you're actively seeking advice on how to stop feeling lonely, then you have that desire for connection. But the problem lies in you trying to execute on that desire, and every attempt to reach out being met with the same emptiness that you were trying to escape. It's like applying to a bunch of jobs, and instead of the employers telling you that you weren't a good fit, you withdraw your own application because you don't think you're a match. What do you mean by that? Glad you asked. I think the idea of starting and building a new connection of any kind, romantic or platonic, is so daunting to people that y'all would rather wait for it to happen naturally or organically, when what you really want is to not be the one that invests more into the dynamic in case things don't work out. Because in your mind, the one that sticks their neck out the furthest is more liable to lose their head. And maybe you think this way because you already bankrolled your emotional stamina one too many times and lost out on those investments, so you retreated, fell into a habit of isolation, blocked off the exit, and now that you've recovered a bit and built that emotional capital back up, you're finding it more difficult to remove those same barriers you put up to keep yourself from losing more. And I bring all this up because I need everyone watching this video struggling with loneliness to understand the key to overcoming this and anything else in life is understanding. Plans, goals, and solutions are 1,000 times more achievable when there is solid, concrete understanding at the base. But the burnout thing is more than just, you know, a one-off comparison. I'm talking about the burnout of having to juggle the social responsibilities of whatever gender roles apply to you and the emotional responsibilities that come with being a friend, a partner, or a relative. You don't think it's weird that you're consistently told throughout life that you have to ignore your instincts in order to be accepted by others? Like, women are taught to center their emotions while men are taught to abandon them. But the thing is, and I may be completely wrong, I'm sure there are millions of women that would love to not feel everything so intensely all the time. And this is genuinely funny to me because, you know, irony is one of my favorite forms of comedy, but I seriously think a lot of this men versus women talk online is just jealousy. Men are jealous of women because they get to unapologetically voice their emotional states and are met with empathy and support. Meanwhile, women are jealous of men because they're great at focusing on the objectivity of things and removing emotional bias from their decision making. Obviously, these are generalized statements and there's always going to be an outlier in any claim, so take what I just said with a few grams of salt. Somehow society has simultaneously made it shameful to be vulnerable and also glamorized authenticity, or at least the look and feel of it. But there is nothing more freeing and attractive than shameless vulnerability. Attractive in a sense that your energy and presence becomes magnetic. Because once you're truly free of judgment of yourself, you view people through a judgeless lens as well. And I talked in the last section about emotional cachet and how we begin to hoard and protect it after so many attempts to make connections. But I think the real reason we struggle to do that in the first place is because people are afraid of their genuine selves being perceived. A lot of y'all have probably seen memes and tweets about having friend groups cross over and how it feels awkward because now you have to jump back and forth between your different personalities depending on who you're interacting with. My question to that is, why would you code switch with the people you expect to accept you for who you are? And I mean, if you really think about it, you're isolating yourself within your own interpersonal relationships. Going back to what I said earlier about genuine connections and being perceived, we're putting too much effort into showing new people the version of us we want them to believe we are instead of presenting who/what we currently are. And that's the real reason you feel so lonely. Because if you display this facade of high self-esteem, confidence, bravery, stableness, this builds skewed expectations in the other person's head that they don't need to show up for you in ways that you genuinely may be in need of. And then you're gonna cry wolf later on because nobody is there for you. Whole time you were sending signals from the very beginning that you didn't need them to be, all because you were too afraid to be vulnerable from the jump. And I think it's especially bad for men because their attempts at vulnerability are really only received through the lens of self-deprecation. Like, more often than not, they have to make a mockery or a joke out of their own suffering in order to not be judged, or at the very least feel like they have to. And in a very twisted and ironic sense, your loneliness is kind of on you, but not because you're incapable of connection, but because you're intrinsically fixated on the end result instead of the process. You will have a much easier time making friends, meeting your future partner, reconnecting with family members once you can start getting excited about the process of building the relationship and getting to know that person. Like, approaching the idea of overcoming your loneliness with fear and skepticism is going to drastically skew your results because you'll be so hyperfixated on the possibility of a negative outcome that you end up completely missing out on the person that's right in front of you. Too many people, myself included, have missed out on beautiful, potentially lifelong relationships with amazing people simply because they either felt like they didn't deserve it or were quite literally afraid of their own shadows and scared that they'd run the person off once authenticity was revealed. Now that's an important note I want people to take away from this video. You should never feel ashamed, fearful, or regretful of showing your true colors to someone. If things go south, so be it. Let that be a them problem. You get to walk away with your head held high, knowing that you laid everything out on the table from the get-go. Not saying that you can't feel disappointment or grief, but that should never fall back onto you as an I deserve to be lonely or I'm always going to be alone sort of statement. And here's the sick twist. This is the kicker. There is beauty in loneliness. There just is. When time is properly spent and dedicated to the right things, being lonely, not isolating, for a while can unlock levels of self-discovery that you didn't even think was possible before. You can fundamentally end up changing your entire trajectory in life by first discovering who the hell you really are at your very core, not who you want to be in the near future, but what you presently value, how you are currently able to love, the capacity you currently have to show up for people. And then you sit with this discovery, you learn to accept the real you, and that's when you can go and attempt to make new connections again. You may end up with people in your life that you would never have considered being a friend or a partner, but that's the beauty of this whole life thing. The less you try to control it, the better your experiences become.